right, good morning. We are live. My name is Nina Ignazik, and welcome to Planet Detroit Live. I'm the founder and executive editor of Planet Detroit, and I am joined today by my colleague, Brian Allnut, our senior reporter who has been covering data center development across Michigan for several months now. Today, we're talking about data centers and local power and what tools and strategies are available to local communities as they face data center proposals multiplying across our state. A few quick notes before we dive in. We're live right now on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So welcome to everyone joining us on those platforms. You can make a comment in the comments of the posts that you're watching, and we will be able to see it here and possibly address any questions. This is a conversation, not a debate. We brought together people with different perspectives and areas of expertise, and our goal is to give you practical information that you can use to understand what's happening in our state right now. So with that, I will turn it over to Brian to set the stage for us.
Thanks, Nina. So why are we having this conversation now? Over the last year, Michigan has seen a surge of interest from major tech companies looking to build large-scale data centers. We're talking about facilities that can span hundreds of acres, consume as much electricity as a large city, and use millions of gallons of water each day for cooling. Proposals have popped up in Washtenaw County, Livingston County, and elsewhere, often in rural townships that have never dealt with development on this scale. Proponents have pointed to potential benefits, including tax revenue, some jobs, and positioning Michigan in the growing digital economy. But communities are also raising serious questions about what happens to local energy grids and utility rates when these facilities come in, how much water the data centers will use and where it comes from, the loss of farmland and green space, and who actually benefits from tax abatements that are on the table. These are the questions local officials and residents are wrestling with right now, often without a playbook. That's what we're here to talk about today. So let's introduce our panelists.
All right, so we have 4 guests with us today, each bringing a different perspective, and I'm so grateful to them, all of them, for their time. So I'll give you about 90 seconds to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what your stake is in this conversation. And we will start with Jeff Reckton. Jeff's a resident of Bridgewater Township in Washtenaw County, where data center development is a major local issue right now. So Jeff, welcome. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved and why this issue is important to you.
Thank you. Yes, as mentioned, my name is Jeff Reschin, and I live on the border of the Saline Township and Bridgewater Township, where the data center is being built in that region. And of course, like many residents, I became aware very late in the process of building this data center, and we were caught unawares of this. And I think one of the things that really speaks to myself and other residents in our area is coming back to the rural nature of our township and the alignment of that rural nature to our township's master plan, which kind of set the vision for how the land would be used in farmland for a long-term strategy, right? So if you look at our master plan, it's not necessarily to be building industrial and commercial sites. It's rather to be, continuing with the farming culture in that township. And I think that's something that a lot of the townships I've spoken with also have been grappling with.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Next up is Wayne Bea. Wayne's a senior attorney at Fahey Schultz Bertzick Rhodes and a certified planner with over 35 years of experience in zoning, planning, and land use law. And he's advising municipalities across Michigan on zoning ordinances, renewable energy siting, and I believe data centers. He's even served as a planning commissioner himself. So Wayne, thank you so much for stepping in last minute to cover for Beth Gibbons, who couldn't be with us today. What are you seeing with your clients in Michigan across related to data centers?
Well, thanks, Nina. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of the panel here. Yeah, so our primary interest is in, representing our communities throughout the state. We represent municipalities, actually hundreds throughout the state, and I'm in the municipal practice group, and we focus primarily on representing communities. I specifically work on zoning ordinances and rezonings, moratoriums, all the things that come with planning development and actually development review. And as you can imagine, based on the number of people that are on this webinar here today, this has been a hot topic, and we've been extensively involved with our communities around the state, either in drafting ordinances or refining what they currently have. We've actually been part of development review processes, holding public hearings, and in some cases, establishing or helping to establish moratoriums for some of the development. But yeah, it's been an issue, I think, that has caught some communities by surprise, and no different than when new uses come on the landscape, such as utility scale renewable energy that many rural communities have been facing. These are new issues that require new solutions, and often require amendments to the zoning ordinance and development review process.
All right, thank you. And then we've got Charlotte Jameson, Chief Policy Officer at the Michigan Environmental Council, where she works on state level energy and environmental policy. So Charlotte, thank you so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in your work and why this issue matters to Michigan.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here today. Obviously, we've seen an incredible interest in data centers, and one of the reasons why we've seen that burgeoning interest from Michiganders is the potential environmental impacts of these data centers. And so at the Environmental Council, we champion lasting protections for Michigan's air, our water, and the places that we love. And we do that by advocacy in Lansing and by working with our partner and member organizations across the state. Data centers are one of those things that uses incredible amounts of energy and incredible amounts of water. And so if we are not putting in place safeguards and common sense regulations around that energy use and that water use, we could see some negative impacts in terms of our bills, our energy and our water bills. We could potentially see some negative impacts related to our ability to meet our climate goals here in Michigan. And we could also see some negative impacts in terms of water use, groundwater depletion, those sorts of things. Those negative things don't have to happen. There are ways to site and to build data centers to help in terms of making our energy and water bills more affordable, and also to help meet our climate goals by building out additional renewables. But those benefits are not assured. And so at the Environmental Council, we are really pushing for statewide regulation that makes sure that we're going to avoid the potential negative impacts of data centers and, realize the potential benefits.
Thank you, Charlotte. And then last but not least, we have Paul Gruber. Paul is with Fresh Coast Climate Solutions, and he's been looking at data centers across the Great Lakes. Paul, can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned?
Yeah, thanks so much, Nina and team, for having me as part of this discussion. So I'm at Fresh Coast Climate Solutions. We're a sustainability consulting firm based here in Ann Arbor. We work with startups up to large companies, governmental entities, large nonprofits, and academic institutions to support sustainability solutions. So we have a sole focus on climate and sustainability solutions in our small business. And we had the lucky opportunity to partner with Joyce Foundation earlier this year to dive into this topic of data centers, to try to understand how can you maximize the potential benefits while minimizing the potential negatives. And so on this slide, you see here, these are sort of the commonly discussed impacts in broad categories that probably everybody on this call is familiar with, but they're a good place to start. Economic benefits potentially, construction operation related jobs, potential for grid reliability, potential for a lot of renewables investment and brownfield redevelopment, all on the potential positive side. Then potential negatives, include high energy demand, obviously, high water demand, grid strain, some considerations, and we're already seeing evidence that costs are increasing due to data centers in certain areas of the U.S. So there's a lot of question on energy and water, certainly. And then land use conflicts, noise, air health impacts, questions on real estate values going up or down, and affordability being a consequence of real estate values changing. And then an increased use of fossil fuels, a lot of natural gas build out, but also pursuit of nuclear coming back. So there's a lot happening in this very evolving space. And with data centers moving more towards hyperscale size, you see just an amplification of potential impacts happening. So that's a broad brush overview of what we first started to tackle. And I've got some more slides I can talk through in a moment as well. So happy to be part of the conversation today.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, let's get into it. What is happening at the local level? Brian, take us there.
So I want to start by grounding this in what's actually happening in specific communities, because the details really matter. So Jeff, let's start with you. Can you walk us through what's happening in Saline Township? When did residents first learn about the data center interest in the area? And what has the process looked like from a community perspective?
Yeah, thanks. So in the summer, we learned that there were starting to be some talks about the data center development amongst the landowners and the developer. But it really wasn't until the September timeframe when most residents started to become familiar with what's going on. And even, like, for example, residents who were 250 yards away didn't realize that this was happening until October. So there's a variety of reasons for that, including community engagement. Some people are less engaged than others, but generally speaking, there was a way and approach where this data center development was not publicized well. And so I think that led to many residents becoming a little bit agitated, that they felt like this is trying to be snuck in under their nose. But as we look at the development, it's actually the land that's to be sold to the developer is around 1,500 acres, about 1,000 of which are in Saline Township and another 500 in the Bridgewater Township. There's 3 landowners who were able to come together to sell this land, and the construction will be occurring on about 300 of those acres, with the remainder of that being relatively untouched for the development. As we look at this development, there are 3 mini data centers to be developed on the land. So they'll be able to have, mostly they're looking to have 1 tenant in this data center, but they could have, split it up into 3 different tenants as well. The primary tenant they're looking at right now is OpenAI and Oracle, which is a partnership that was created to build these data centers for AI. The interesting thing about the site and the AI data centers in general is that these sites are not typical for data center developments. They are farther away from centers where there's multiple sources of power, redundancy, multiple sources of internet redundancy. And so with AI data center developments like this, the model has shifted a little bit. The purpose of a site like this is to train the AI models that someone would use, and that training happens offline. So much of the training does not require someone getting access to that through the internet. So that includes things like uploading a lot of content to that data center and then having the model be created through a lot of GPU parsing of this data. So with these graphical processing units, they get very, very hot. And so there's a lot of demand for cooling. With this data center site, the developer has promised to use a closed loop system for the cooling, which means that the water usage on this particular site is less than that would be for a traditional AI data center or a traditional data center in general that uses evaporative cooling methodologies to keep this site cold. However, the downside of having a closed loop system is the amount of electricity demand is much more than a traditional data center or a traditional AI data center. The demand for this center is about a gigawatt or more. They've requested up to 1.4 gigawatts. To give you context, that's more than 1 million homes worth of electricity. So it is a significant.
I gotta cut in for a second. I want to give Wayne a chance to weigh in here. Thank you for all that background. Wayne, you've worked with municipalities across Michigan on zoning and land use issues. From a legal and planning perspective, what are the dynamics at play when a data center proposal lands on a rural township's doorstep? What kind of challenges do local governments face?
Right. Yeah. Certainly, I think some of those issues have been well laid out here. Yet, I think probably the first thing that comes to mind is that, in many respects, if assuming there is local zoning, that the data centers perhaps have not been defined in the zoning ordinance in a way that I guess resembles the type of applications that they're getting, have coming in. I mean, data centers are not new, right? We've had data centers for some time, yet it's really the size and perhaps location and phasing of these that are different. And just like any new land use that would come into a community, it really requires the community to kind of step back. First of all, as a planner and lawyer, the first thing I would say is that, well, what does your master plan say if in particular, a use is being proposed, let's say in a rural area, and then so the policy part of it, and this is where I think communities need to have a head start here and be able to identify what are those policies that they have for data centers if they come in, and then also, of course, having your zoning ordinance. Most communities have not had regulations in place that really address the enormous size of the data centers that are coming in. So all those different components, whether it's your water and sewer, noise, having escrow account fees available to be able to help for the development review. But I think in short, it's really identifying how they are currently addressed and where some of the regulations might be lacking.
We're going to move on. So thank you so much for that, Wayne. Our next section, we're going to talk a little bit more about what tools we have in the toolbox to deal with these. Wayne, let's start at the local level. We've heard about moratoriums, and some communities have actually implemented those. And those are temporary pauses on development to give communities time to plan. What are the legal options? What is a moratorium? What are there model ordinances or policies that communities can look to?
Right. Yeah. So, moratorium is one of the tools in the toolbox. And, typically a moratorium would be used to stop a particular type of development. A pause is probably more accurate, where to give a community time, let's say in the instance that I mentioned earlier, where there really are no regulations in place. It's not listed as a use per se, as a special land use in a particular district. A moratorium is a legal instrument that communities can use to put in place that would allow them time to develop the ordinances and regulations and review processes that they see fit. It's really and it's what's important to note. A moratorium is not or should not be used as a mechanism to just stop the development. There's other mechanisms, but that is really meant to be a moratorium is a pause. And the courts have supported moratoriums as long as they're within a reasonable period of time, and the community is doing their due diligence to move along with adopting the regulations, which were the purpose. So the moratorium really has to spell out what its purpose is. If it's for data center, it needs to define within that moratorium what it is that is the moratorium affects, and needs to have a time limit. And oftentimes moratoriums, let's say if they're a year long, there would be a mechanism to renew that for another 6 months or up to another year. But again, they're meant to be a temporary mechanism to allow the community to address the concerns that need to be put in place.
Got it. So Charlotte, you look at things, I know a lot more at the state level. What policy tools or legislative options are you looking at the state level that could give communities support or authority here or guide better outcomes?
Yeah, currently Michigan doesn't really have much in the way of regulation when it comes to these hyperscale data centers. We have some requirements if there's going to be if the data center is pursuing a sales and use tax exemption. There's some requirements around water conservation and around cleaner energy. But again, those are sort of permissive and only apply if the data center is going to pursue that tax exemption. What we really need is statewide protections in place. And I think those look like requiring the data center to build out and pay for renewable energy and battery storage. The data center proposal in Saline is doing that on the battery storage side. We haven't seen any additional conversation around building out renewable energy to power those batteries. It also looks like requirements that the data center pay for all of the infrastructure that they need, energy and water, so that those costs aren't borne by other customers. And then it looks like putting in place requirements around water conservation and water efficiency, energy efficiency, common sense sort of protections about how to operate the business in the least sort of impactful way on our resources here in Michigan. And then finally, I'd say, there should be some noise regulations to protect local communities. There should be some regulations around requiring community benefit agreements. So these are agreements with communities that are hosting these data centers that the data center is going to provide some additional benefits to the community to help lessen the sort of burden of having this big data center in their neighborhoods. So those are some of the things that we're really looking at. But again, right now the state has not acted There has been some work at the Public Service Commission around electric utility rates and how these things might impact other customers. But there's not been any action by our state legislature.
Got it. Thank you. So that's a great segue into this section with Paul. Paul, I know you have a few slides, so I'm going to just ask you to tell me if you want me to go to the next slide. But you've been spending a lot of time looking at this issue beyond Michigan. What are other states doing? Are they doing any of the things that Charlotte mentioned that we might want to pay attention to?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this was a funding and a project through the Joyce Foundation. We've been looking at this issue since about April of this year, so not terribly long, but a lot has happened just in 2025. We've got, at the start of the year, we had industry saying they're going to invest maybe hundreds of billions of dollars. But just since the beginning of the year, that's really grown to planned investments, planned construction of new data centers in the trillions of dollars by, or 1.4 plus trillion dollars by 2030. And I've even seen some, estimates beyond that. So the scale of intended investment is really huge. And the best way we found to track and categorize all the potential impacts, the potential solutions, or better practices, as we're calling them, is through news media and impact reports and the early case studies of how these developments have happened in places like Northern Virginia. Folks on the call may know the biggest cluster of data centers in the U.S. is called Data Center Alley in Northern Virginia, right outside D.C. And so you've got data centers interspersed in residential neighborhoods and a lot of impacts happening, noise, health concerns, et cetera. So we've been tracking this on a nationwide front, a little bit globally too, and then honing in on the relevance to the Great Lakes states. So we've looked at over 4,500 articles and various reports, and we've profiled dozens of better practices, also a lot of practices where the jury's still out. We don't know whether they're going to have a net positive or net negative impact on the economy, on the environment, on communities. And then there's a whole host of other practices we've profiled. You can look up, I think there's going to be a link shared to the Joyce Foundation website. All of this is up there and available and more. We profiled practices that we think are going to be net negatives. Reinvesting in fossil fuels is going to push back climate change goals if we don't change course and come up with some alternatives like using renewables. So just to hit the highlights here, I think as the other speakers have already shared, the first step is this awareness building, which has been growing throughout the year too, thanks to great reporting, great work by research institutions and journalists like Planet Detroit. This is a new business category that's developed that requires new policies, new programs, and we're already seeing states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and others, Michigan too, revisiting previous policies and reconsidering tax incentive structures for data centers and other tariffs and other things that, given the impacts that we're already seeing in some areas of the U.S., we want to be proactive and avoid potential negative impacts on ratepayers, on particular communities. So chiefly, this is a new business category. There are new developer requirements, new requirements that can be established at the state, county, and local levels, as the other speakers have been discussing. There's a lot of attention and growing evidence that the costs of electricity and natural gas can increase due to data centers. There's a lot of attention on locating data centers in primarily disadvantaged communities, for example, like Ypsilanti, Michigan, down the road from me here, in rural areas like Saline or rural areas like Howell, Michigan. There's a lot of focus on using tools that exist in the energy efficiency and load management, demand response space, and how can we maximize the ability to control loads at data centers so that they don't put a strain on the grid. So some interesting thinking there. Energy efficiency, water efficiency, promoting renewables or requiring renewables as part of developments are tools that are some states and communities are beginning to pursue. And then chiefly, there's still a pretty large disconnect, I'd say, between private industry, maybe talking with states and some groups, but not necessarily talking with local communities and having communities be informed early on in the process. Folks in Ohio and Michigan too, I'm sure, Charlotte, you've seen this, and Wayne, you mentioned it too, or Jeff, excuse me, you mentioned it. communities don't often get involved until the 4th or 5th step in a 5 or 6 step process. And that's not, the most appropriate way to engage all relevant stakeholders, right? Community members, nonprofit groups, and others that are concerned about impacts and want to help measure those impacts and make sure they're mitigated or eliminated really should be engaged at the early step. So we mentioned a few examples of things happening here that'll lead to that better collaboration.
Great.
And
Did you want to talk through any of the minute?
Yeah, so
we have like 1 minute left for this section. So
okay.
if you want to talk a little bit about Minnesota.
So I think one of the best comprehensive sets of policies coming out of Great Lakes State is happening in Minnesota. And this has evolved a little bit even since we drafted up this slide. But as I just mentioned, the first thing they did was add a new category for this type of industrial development. So they call it a qualified large-scale data center, and they included a lot of requirements for development, requirements of solar, prevailing wage, peak usage fees, other forms of renewable energy. The building must be built to green sustainability standards. I say streamline permitting here. That's a little bit of a balance. You see this a lot in Pennsylvania too. They want to not lose potential investment in the state, but set forward enough requirements to make it reasonable for all stakeholders. So this is a little bit about streamlined permitting, but it's also more about being able to communicate transparently between government agencies, at least at the state level, what's happening in the permitting process for these types of developments. I don't know that it bridges the gap to local communities as much as it should, but I think that's a need other states should pursue, the communication of what's happening between state level and community level and engaging those stakeholders earlier. Minnesota's moving a little bit towards that direction. I think more could be done. And then water evaluation. This was a first for Midwest states, I believe. So requiring that data center developers disclose what their water usage is going to look like, rates and volumes per day, month, and year, anticipated source of that water, and then having other particular requirements regarding the use of that water. So a good step forward. Does it go all the way? I think it's a good step forward and a good model to reference when other states and communities are considering these types of requirements.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to move on to our next section to talk a little bit more about some of the impacts and benefits. So I'll let Brian take it from here.
Yeah, we've heard a bit about potential benefits from data centers, mostly tax revenue and jobs. But we've also heard concerns about the impact. So let's try to get specific. Charlotte and Paul, let's start with the impacts. What do data centers mean for climate goals, water resources, and land use? What should communities be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think from a climate perspective, the question is how adding this much additional electric load to the grid, what that means in terms of what sort of resources we're building out going forward. So in other states, we've seen this addition of significant new load really quickly mean that we're building out a bunch of gas plants or we're keeping coal plants online longer than we otherwise would have. And that obviously means more greenhouse gas emissions. And it makes the job way harder in terms of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in line with what we need to do to combat climate change. So that's the ultimate crux of the issue on the climate side of things. When it comes to water, if the data center is using significant water resources, it really matters where that water is coming from, right? If they're pulling directly from the Great Lakes, that's a huge system. We probably have a lot of leeway in terms of how much water the data centers can use daily before we see any impacts, if ever. If they're pulling from groundwater, obviously having significant daily use of groundwater is going to potentially lead to depletion of that groundwater resource. And in Michigan, we think of ourselves as a very water-rich state. We are, but that doesn't mean that we can't see negative impacts from a water conservation or water quantity perspective. And so it's really about thinking through where the data centers are going to get their energy from. Can we make sure that it's clean, renewable energy? Where they're going to get their water from, and can we make sure that they're pulling from a place where we're not going to see those negative impacts?
Yep. Paul, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, that was all very well said. I totally agree. I mean, it puts, because industry wants to develop data centers so quickly, and get them operational quickly, they're wanting to coordinate quickly with utilities, understand the grid, resource, understand power generation, and where that might be lacking, they want to put in power generation themselves, either on site behind the meter or nearby, front of the meter. And that means a lot of industry is looking at natural gas, looking at refiring coal-fired power plants, or maybe even more than that, looking at conventional nuclear and small modular nuclear. So it's a return to, some very, fossil fuels that we want to phase out. It's a return conversation on nuclear. It's a return to the conversation on carbon capture and storage related to natural gas. You see Google and others investing in that, ExxonMobil getting engaged in that again. So it's going to be a lot tougher, as Charlotte said, if you're pursuing those paths and not pursuing as many renewables and battery storage, and geothermal, it's going to be harder to achieve our climate goals. Some are going to get pushed back. Some may be in total jeopardy. So that's the conversation I'm glad is being, you all are contributing to, and all the listeners are as well. We need to keep asking those questions and figure out how you can push more on the renewables button than the other options that lead to climate change. And then water too, I think I'd just add, again, very important to understand. Yeah, as you see in the slide here, these are average values for energy, water, and land use for one facility. The numbers are all over the place and they're evolving, and they're pretty much growing as industry moves towards more hyperscalers. So energy usage, the equivalent to a small city or larger, 1 to 5 million gallons per day for hyperscalers, as you see in the parentheses there. A lot of land use, 500 plus acres for these big campuses. So communities should have the decision-making authority, the power to decide, is this the best use of our land, best interconnection we want to have with the grid and energy use, and best water use compared to other uses. Say it's industrial ag, or it's a family-owned farm, or any other type of use of that land. We're at the stage now where we're presenting and discussing this, and communities should weigh their options when they want to pursue this or consider something different.
Thanks, Paul. Wayne, from a legal planning standpoint, when a developer comes to a township with promises of tax revenue and jobs, what kinds of questions should local officials be asking?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, under Michigan, our state's enabling acts, the Zoning Enabling Act, Planning Enabling Act, first of all, there needs to be a demonstrated need for a particular development. If a community is in a position or inclined to say we don't want these, and they either do or do not put regulations in place to be able to at least accommodate. So I think that's important to understand that, if the premise is that, we're just going to say, no to them, that does present some legal challenges. And I think, working closely with your municipal attorney and council to be able to make sure that the right remedy is put in place for what the desired outcome is a good place to start. So I think that's probably one of the first things that I would suggest. And then secondly, I think there, because of what was mentioned here, these are enormous type of facilities. There really should be a well thought out application process. An application should be deemed complete, before it goes through a thorough review, whether that's locally or with the help of consultants. So you want to make sure that you have a complete application that has, assuming there are some regulations in place, that all that has been addressed in the application process before you get into some of the review. And of course, you need to be reasonable in that and due diligence with moving forward with an application. Yet there's a lot of information that oftentimes is going to be required before a planning commission, township board, elected body can be in a position to even even deliberate on something like this.
Thanks, Wayne. I think we're going to move on to the next portion now, Nina.
Sure, I can take over. So Wayne and Paul, let's talk a little bit about community benefits agreements and development agreements. When the community promises local benefits in exchange for approval of tax breaks, how should communities evaluate those promises, especially in terms of kind of the proportionality of the impact and the revenue that we're talking about here? Wayne, maybe you can start.
Sure. Well, first of all, just if you're talking about any type of development, these types of requests need to be proportional to the type of impacts that are anticipated. In Michigan, there's certainly case law and so forth about concerns and problems with requiring exactions or offsite improvements. So I think the first thing is to be able to identify what are those impacts that you're trying to address through a community benefits agreement. And what's critical is to be able to have some language within your ordinance, particularly if you have for data centers, defining what you mean by a community benefits agreement and how that will be evaluated. So I think that would be to me part of the first part of the analysis for a community benefits agreement.
Paul, do you have anything to add? Have you seen anything in other states?
Yeah, I think Wayne, maybe knows more, but does know more about the structure of community benefits agreements. Jeff, I know you've been following this too, and Celine. I think big picture, if we're looking at hyperscalers that are $1 billion plus investment, they're looking at profitability within some short time period, which could be, revenue, of course, north of $1 billion, and then, annual profitability in the tens, hundreds of millions conceivably. So when you look at that scale of investment, that scale that businesses are having, I think communities are well positioned to ask for quite a lot, and perhaps more than has been achieved in some of these early developments where, like in Celine, the developer sued the city, and then a settlement agreement was reached, right? It was 14 or 20 million or something total that Celine's going to get out of this in addition to tax revenue. So I think chiefly, are there avenues to pursue a fair share of tax revenue for communities that want to pursue these developments? We're also seeing, I think that, the doors are open to pursue a lot of potential benefits. Celine, again, I think had some good examples of supporting the fire department and some other things. I think that's always worth looking at. We heard at a recent conference on clean energy where data center developers were present that some are proposing putting in residential heat pumps and helping a community decarbonize. So are there smart energy sharing and decarbonization or electrification strategies that will reduce carbon emissions overall for a community faster than would have happened otherwise? This assumes, of course, the data center is renewables, using renewables, patched into a grid using renewables, etc. But there might be these supplemental benefits, that could push the needle further on climate change. I'm not saying that'll happen everywhere. But I do think there's that opportunity for communities to pursue that type of conversation. It's around not just mitigating impacts, but potential, net benefits to achieve our climate goals. Why not have that conversation with developers? Mm-hmm. One other thing, I'll just plant the seed for folks, if you're not already thinking this way, I'm curious for communities that want to pursue data centers to have them have a conversation on what type of data is being used. And Wayne, Jeff, Charlotte, you might have insights into the feasibility of this, but I'd love for communities to be in a position to say, hey, we'd like the data, that's running through this facility that, we've agreed to be used for scientific, medical, and, other breakthroughs, as opposed to something that might have less, societal benefit. So the degree to which that can happen, I'm not sure, but I think that conversation would be important. If a community is weighing a data center that's going to do a lot of beneficial things with that data compared to not, I think they lean towards one over the other.
Before we go to Jeff, I do want to give Wayne a chance to respond to that, because it's an interesting idea. Is there anything within Michigan's planning framework that would allow a community to stipulate the kind of data going through a data center, or the kind of use in your work, knowledge?
Not that I'm aware of, and on that, and I think part of the premise here is that any type of conditions and so forth that are put on, have to be within the premise of what's allowed within the Zoning Enabling Act. Mm-hmm. So I think as I mentioned earlier, if you start identifying what I'll call a community impacts analysis, that's really going to be the first thing, so that you have a study that really identifies what are going to be the impacts on community resources, and then ask the applicant to be able to demonstrate in their application how they ensure to are going to address those impacts. So I think you have to step back from that aspect. But similar to different uses you have within a zoning ordinance, you could have 3 different types of commercial uses and so forth. So there's some refinements, or an analogy with renewables. Communities oftentimes will define personal renewable project, let's say on a residence, versus utility scale. So, there are some refinements that you can do in there, but I think you have to be careful when you're starting to get into the actual operation of the business.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, before we go to audience questions, which I know we have a lot of, I wanted to give Jeff an opportunity to kind of have the last word from a resident's perspective. Jeff, what do you think a good deal would actually look like? What would make you feel like your community is genuinely benefiting?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that question gets to the heart of some of the challenges with these data centers in rural areas, right? Rural areas don't have a lot of infrastructure, don't have a lot of demand for, additional tax revenues. So, if I ask my neighbors, hey, what could we do with $2 million? Can we pave the roads? They would say, I don't want my roads paved, right? I like the way the roads are. So there's very little that I think we could do with those $2 million. And that's something that I think a lot of townships and other planners should consider when they're potentially going to be courted for these types of developments. What's a good use of the money? Of course, fire and schools are great, but that's not the only component. A second concern that I think the townships should have is around the bonds, to make sure that if a data center project doesn't go through, or the developer backs out, or things go abandoned, that there's enough money in the bond to cover the huge expense of undoing a lot of the work that's been done on the land. So, for example, with the Saline Township project, I think it's a $5 or $10 million bond. it doesn't, it's minute in scale of the project, right? And then the last thing I would like to leave with is considering the things that we've learned from this particular project in Saline Township. The first one is making sure that planners have an updated future land use plan, an updated master plan to ensure that they have industrial zoning if they don't have it already, right? So one of the issues was exclusionary zoning for Saline. And so in the absence of a specific area that's been zoned industrial, they were pressured into zoning this agricultural land to industrial. And then finally, I think generally speaking, considering that these projects, they use a different superhighway than we've known about in the past. That superhighway is the most high voltage power lines in our state. And so those 300 or 400 kilovolt power lines are the ones that these data centers want to be near. And they have to be near in order to reduce the cost of building their infrastructure. So if you have those lines running through your communities, then you can have a future insight into where these developers would want to be.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to move for a few minutes to audience questions before wrapping up. I know we've got a few, and we have Dustin behind the scenes here to add questions. I'll just allow panelists to grab onto these. What can communities actually do to stop or slow data center development is our first question. Anyone want to jump in?
Well, I think earlier there was the conversation around potential local moratoriums, which are, a pause in terms of development of data centers and gives communities an opportunity to think through what updates to their zoning and other local ordinances they would need to make. So that doesn't stop a data center permanently, but it does buy a community some time. The other thing is, pushing for statewide moratoriums until some of these regulations and protections are in place. Again, those moratoriums are generally a pause, but those are the sorts of things that I think would lead to a slowdown in data center development. I don't think there's any appetite in our legislature for an outright ban. But that is another path as well.
All right. Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in, or should we move on to the next question? All right, Dustin, you got another question for us. What if the AI bubble bursts while the data centers are being built? What's going to happen?
So we've been tracking this on a national, global level. This rapidly growing market, trillions in intended investment, like I shared earlier, and then with that, a lot of appropriate scrutiny. Okay, are we overbuilding? Is industry overbuilding? And are we going to have stranded assets at some point? There are also a lot of data centers that upgrade their equipment, every 3 to 5 years. So there's a huge e-waste potential issue. There are data centers that will be using older equipment. Will they continue to, be able to survive, or will they shut down? So I think because data centers have been around a while, and these questions have really just come to the fore because of the scale of growth and the scale of data center investments and the size of data centers themselves and all their equipment and vendors and supply chain. So it's an open question.
Mm-hmm.
If the bubble bursts, it's sort of, it would be hard to imagine the entire AI industry collapsing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think certain segments, certain geographies could struggle more than others.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what we're seeing now. And then, some people think on the flip side, just counterpoint, that we're just getting going on AI, and with robotics and performance improvements and and the potential for societal solutions coming through AI, that this is just an early step. I'm inclined to think it's pretty large, and there is some risk associated with it, but hopefully any bubble bursting will be in small pockets and can be alleviated in other ways.
All right. Oh, looks like we got a new question. Jordan from Saline Township lives north of the data center. Is there any recourse if the MPSC approves ex parte today, or what then? Anyone want to?
We at the Environmental Council have asked the commission to deny the ex parte application and to make this a fully transparent contested case. If the commission doesn't do that and decides to grant approval of DTE's contract with Related and Oracle in the Saline Township data center case, there is the option around appeal of that decision to various court jurisdictions. So there is another avenue to continue to challenge that decision. But again, the success of that appeal depends a lot on what the commission does today. So we'll be keeping an eye on it, but I would say that there is definitely some legal recourse moving forward.
Yeah, and just so everyone knows, thanks for that. We'll be covering that as well today, 1 p.m. The Michigan Public Service Commission will take the Saline Data Center up on its agenda, and we don't know what's going to happen. So it's an exciting day. Is water usage really a problem? Anybody want to jump in on this one?
I can jump in on that. So I think there's certain ways they develop these sites, which can be low water use, and also less expensive ways that use a lot of water, an extremely large amount of water. For most communities that are impacted by, these developments, they're rural in nature and the source of the water is the groundwater. And so it does affect the residents' wells and things like that. And for me, when my well was put in 2003, it's only 90 feet deep. So that's not very deep. And I think it can be affected by these drawdowns.
I'll just add to the not understanding what water usage is going to look like for a potential facility is definitely a problem. You want to at least get some transparency around water usage, which is why you see states like Minnesota and others, pursuing water requirements for these facilities. Disclose so we can understand the potential impacts and study them. And every site's going to be different, whether it's municipal or well water or even from the Great Lakes. So each project, water needs to be understood and studied carefully, and then communities make a decision around whether that's an appropriate use or not.
Nina, I was just going to jump in on one aspect of that. So, I think a lot of the issues that have been identified, it really, really highlights the importance of bringing in some third-party consultants and experts to be able to help. It's going to be very rare that there's going to be that local expertise. And so, the ability to, have put together an escrow account fee to be able to, have, in essence, the developer be able to pay for those studies. And again, that doesn't mean that if they're paying for it, that they have to, you've got to approve the project, but it does allow you to have a third party consultant to look at these very sophisticated issues. And, I just wanted to mention too that, any of the comments, my comments are meant to be, educational rather than legal advice. So you always should contact your local attorney for, any particular legal advice on these matters.
Thank you. Okay, we are down to 1 minute left. Anybody else want to jump in with any final thoughts as we go into the rest of the day?
I can leave a parting thought here. You know, at least for the Saline Township data center, it's a gigawatt scale. And for us, if we wanted to offset this power consumption with solar deployment, we would be looking at about 10,000 acres worth of land that's needed. So we have to be thinking about the downstream effects of this in the real acreage. And, you know, we've got 6.8 gigawatts planned here in Michigan. So that's, you know, that's approximately 70,000 acres that we need to think about
if we were
potentially
going to do
being moved.
solar. Yeah.
What is that going to do to our food supply and other things?
Got it. Well, I'm so grateful to all of you for being here with us today. If you are online, thank you for joining us, and apologies if we didn't get to all of the questions, but please reach out to us at planetdetroit.org. We will continue to cover data centers and what happens as we move into the rest of the year and years to come. So thank you again for being here today. And thanks to all of our panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right, we are going to end our stream. Thank you. Bye.